A light drizzle began to fall over the bustling city as pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, clutching umbrellas and ducking their heads to avoid the rain. The faint glow of neon lights reflected in puddles on the street, and the distant sound of a car horn echoed through the urban chaos. Amid the crowd, unnoticed by most, sat a young girl on the corner of a busy intersection. Her clothes were frayed, her face smudged with dirt, and her eyes reflected a mixture of desperation and resilience. The girl, Emma, pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as the rain seeped through the fabric. She was no older than 17, but life on the streets had aged her spirit. Her usual spot, a quiet bench by the park, was too exposed in this weather, so she had moved closer to the busy street, hoping someone might spare her a second glance. She wasn't one to beg outright. Her pride wouldn't let her. Instead, she relied on the kindness of strangers who occasionally noticed her sketchbook filled with beautiful, intricate drawings, her only outlet for the dreams she still clung to. Tonight, the city's pulse seemed more frantic than usual. A sleek black car, a symbol of wealth and power, was parked at the curb not far from where Emma sat. Inside the car, a man in his late 30s adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror. Jacob Harrington, a self-made millionaire known for his sharp business acumen and impeccable taste, looked every bit the part of a man who had it all. Yet if someone looked closer, they might have seen the faint lines of worry etched into his otherwise flawless appearance. Jacob had been distracted all day. His wife, Elena, had been acting strangely for weeks. Their marriage, once filled with passion and partnership, now felt strained and distant. She avoided eye contact, her laughter sounded forced, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Tonight, he planned to confront her after attending a late-night meeting. A meeting he didn't want to attend but couldn't afford to miss. As Jacob started the engine, Emma's eyes instinctively darted to the car. It wasn't uncommon for luxury vehicles to catch her attention. There were symbols of a life she could only dream of. But something about this car felt different. She noticed a small, unusual movement near the rear wheel, a subtle creak and a faint, almost imperceptible sway. Her mind, sharp despite her circumstances, immediately zeroed in on it. Emma's heart raced as she pieced together a terrifying possibility. She had once helped a mechanic in exchange for a meal, and in those brief hours, she learned how dangerous certain signs could be. Her instincts screamed at her to act, but she hesitated. Who would listen to a homeless girl? She could almost hear the dismissive responses in her head, the judgmental glances, the cold shoulders. But the thought of staying silent haunted her even more. Jacob reached for the gear shift, ready to pull into traffic. Emma's pulse quickened. Her feet seemed rooted to the ground as she wrestled with her fear. Finally, she bolted forward, waving her arms frantically. "Wait! Don't drive!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of the city. Jacob frowned, his hand hovering over the steering wheel. He rolled down the window just enough to hear her. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp and impatient. Emma's chest heaved as she struggled to find the right words. "Your car. The brakes. Someone tampered with them," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? How would you even know that?" I saw it," she stammered, pointing toward the rear of the car. "Please, just check before you drive. I swear I'm not lying." Inside the car, Jacob hesitated. The girl looked desperate, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made him pause. Still, he couldn't ignore the knowing doubt. Was this just some elaborate ploy for attention? Or worse, a scam? Before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. Elena, his wife, appeared out of the shadows, her face pale and her expression strained. She hadn't expected Jacob to still be there. For a moment, the three of them were frozen in a strange, charged silence. Jacob in his car, Emma drenched in rain, and Elena, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. The tension was palpable, and then Elena broke it. "Jacob, what are you still doing here?" she asked, her voice cracking ever so slightly. Jacob's gaze flickered between his wife and the girl, his mind racing with questions. But before he could ask any of them, Emma blurted out, "Your wife. She's the one who cut the brakes." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and time seemed to stand still. Jacob's face darkened with a mix of disbelief and anger, while Elena's eyes widened in shock, or perhaps guilt. It was impossible to tell in that fleeting moment. But Emma wasn't finished. "I saw her earlier," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't understand what she was doing at first, but now I know she was tampering with the car." Jacob turned to Elena, his mind reeling. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Elena's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she glanced around as though searching for an escape route. Her hesitation spoke volumes, and Jacob felt the ground shift beneath him. The rain intensified, and the city seemed to fade into the background as the three of them stood there, trapped in a moment of unspoken truths and unanswered questions. Whatever was about to unfold next would change their lives forever. Jacob's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the rain drummed harder against the car. His jaw clenched, and his piercing gaze shifted from Emma to Elena. The words Emma had just spoken hung heavily in the air, impossible to ignore. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts, but the whirlwind of emotions inside him made it impossible to focus. He didn't know what was more shocking, the accusation itself or the fact that his wife hadn't denied it outright. Elena finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Jacob, please, don't listen to her. She's trying to manipulate you. I don't even know who she is." Her words sounded desperate, but there was a faint crack in her tone that Jacob couldn't overlook. It wasn't just desperation, it was fear. His instincts, honed through years of navigating high-stakes business deals, told him there was more to this story than Elena was letting on. He turned his attention back to Emma, who stood shivering in the rain, her eyes wide with urgency. "Why would you say something like that?" Jacob asked Emma, his voice low but firm. "Do you have proof?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. Proof? Of course, she didn't have any solid evidence. All she had were the fragments of what she'd seen earlier. A well-dressed woman crouched near the car, fiddling with something around the wheels. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. But now, with the puzzle pieces fitting together, she knew she couldn't stay silent. "I saw her," Emma said finally, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "She was messing with the car. I didn't know what she was doing at first, but now I'm sure. Please, you have to believe me." Jacob leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. This girl, homeless, soaking wet, and a stranger, had nothing to gain from lying to him. But his wife? The woman he had trusted and built a life with. The very idea that she could do something so deliberate and dangerous made his stomach churn. Elena stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Jacob, this is ridiculous. Are you really going to believe some random girl over me, your wife? We've been married for 10 years. Do you honestly think I'd do something like this?" Jacob's eyes locked onto hers, searching for any hint of the truth. "I don't know what to think right now, Elena," he said, his voice heavy. "But I do know something doesn't feel right." Elena's face crumpled for a moment before she straightened, her expression shifting to one of defiance. "You know what? Fine. Believe her if you want. But don't come crying to me when you realize she's just trying to scam you for money." Emma flinched at the accusation. "I don't want your money," she said quietly, but her voice carried conviction. "I just want to stop you from getting hurt. That's all." Jacob exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced at his phone, his meeting already overdue, and then back at the two women standing before him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was telling the truth, but he also couldn't ignore the implications as she was right. His marriage, his entire life, could unravel in an instant. "Stay here," Jacob said abruptly, stepping out of the car. He moved toward the rear, crouching to inspect the brakes himself. The rain was relentless, soaking through his expensive suit, but he didn't care. His hands trembled as he examined the car, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he hoped, prayed, he wouldn't find anything. But then he saw it. A small, deliberate cut in the brake line, almost invisible to the untrained eye. His heart stopped. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. Jacob stood up slowly, his mind reeling. He turned to face Elena, who had gone pale as a ghost. Her eyes darted to the car, then to him, and Jacob saw it, the fleeting look of panic she tried to mask. He felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over him, and his fists clenched at his sides. "Elena," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you want to explain this?" Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered toward Emma, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and determination. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you're talking about." Jacob's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Don't insult me, Elena. I'm looking at the cut brake line right now. Someone tampered with it, and you were here earlier. So tell me the truth. Why?" Elena's face crumpled again, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. "Jacob, I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice breaking. I needed to make you listen to me." Jacob stared at her, his mind unable to process what he was hearing. Listen to you. You thought cutting my brakes would get my attention. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Elena cried. I felt so invisible, Jacob. You're always so busy, always so focused on your work, and I just wanted you to notice me again, to see me. Her words hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you risked my life? What if I'd driven off without noticing? What if I crashed? I didn't think it through, Elena admitted, her voice barely audible. I was desperate. I thought if you had a scare, maybe you'd realize how much you need me. Emma, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. You're lucky I was here, she said, her voice firm. You could kill them. Or someone else. Elena turned to Emma, her expression filled with a mix of anger and shame. You don't know anything about us, she snapped. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. You're right, Emma replied, her tone softening. I don't know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to feel invisible in the world. And I know that doesn't give you the right to hurt someone else. Jacob's heart ached as he looked at his wife, the woman he thought he knew. The rain continued to fall, blurring the edges of the moment, but Jacob's mind was clear. He had a choice to make, a choice that would shape not only his future but the lives of everyone involved. But for now, the only thing he could do was stand there, caught between anger, sorrow, and disbelief as the storm raged on around them. Jacob stood motionless, rain dripping from his hair and soaking his clothes, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the turmoil raging within him. His mind replayed Elena's words, each one sharper than the last. Invisible, neglected. It didn't make sense. He had worked tirelessly to provide her with a life of comfort, luxury, and security, hadn't he? Elena's tears kept coming, but Jacob couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He wanted to shout, to demand how she could justify risking his life over something so twisted, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he turned to Emma, the girl who had been brave enough to stop him. For the first time, he saw her not as a stranger, but as someone who had just saved his life. Thank you, Jacob said, his voice low but sincere. I don't even know your name, but you may have saved me tonight. It's Emma, she replied softly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. And I just did what anyone should do. Her words stung Jacob in an unexpected way. Would anyone else have done what she did? In a world where most people turned away from the homeless, where people like Emma were invisible by default, he doubted it. He wanted to ask her more, to know her story, but his focus was still on Elena. Elena stood a few steps away, hugging herself as if the cold rain had just begun to seep into her bones. Her mascara streaked down her face, and she looked small, fragile, and broken in a way Jacob had never seen before. For a fleeting moment he felt pity, but it was quickly swallowed by anger. I don't know what to do with this, Elena, Jacob said finally, his voice rough. I don't even know who you are anymore. Elena flinched, but she didn't respond. Her silence felt like an admission, a quiet surrender to the weight of her actions. Emma's eyes darted between the couple, her discomfort evident. She didn't want to be part of their private argument, but she couldn't just walk away either. Something about Elena's expression, a mix of guilt and sorrow, tugged at her. Emma had seen that look before, on the faces of people who had lost everything. As the silence stretched, the sound of distant sirens cut through the rain. Jacob's head snapped up. Did you call someone? He asked Emma. She shook her head quickly. No, I. Before she could finish, a police cruiser turned the corner and slowed as it approached them. Jacob's stomach dropped. The sleek car, his wife's tear-streaked face, and the shivering homeless girl would all look like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to assemble. He didn't need this to spiral further out of control. Two officers stepped out of the car, their eyes scanning the scene. One of them, a middle-aged man with a steady gaze, approached. Everything all right here? He asked, his tone neutral but probing. Jacob hesitated. The last thing he wanted was for this nightmare to become a spectacle, but he couldn't lie outright. We're fine, he said carefully. Just a disagreement. The officer's gaze flickered to Emma, then Elena, and finally the car. This your vehicle? Yes, Jacob replied, his voice tightening. The officer nodded slowly, his trained eyes catching the tension in the air. Mind if we take a look? Just a routine check. Jacob opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Emma stepped forward. There's something wrong with the car, she said firmly. The brake line? It's been cut. The officer's brows lifted slightly, and he signaled to his partner, who immediately crouched to inspect the vehicle. Jacob shot Emma a look of surprise, but she met his gaze without flinching. They needed to know, she said quietly. The second officer straightened, his expression grim. She's right. The brake line's been tampered with. Jacob closed his eyes, a fresh wave of anger and disbelief washing over him. This was no longer just a private nightmare, it was now a matter of law. He glanced at Elena, who had gone pale again. She didn't move, her body frozen as if she could will herself invisible. "Do you know anything about this?" the first officer asked, his tone now sharp. Elena's lips parted, but no sound came out. Jacob stepped forward, his hands raised slightly. "Look, it's complicated," he began, trying to shield her from the immediate consequences. "We're still figuring things out." The officer frowned. Complicated or not, tampering with a vehicle is serious business. Someone could have been killed. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jacob knew the officer was right. If Emma hadn't spoken up, he might not be standing here. He nodded slowly. "I understand." Elena's voice finally broke through the tension, trembling but resolute. "It was me," she said, her words barely audible over the rain. "I'm the one who did it." The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I need you to explain that." Elena drew a shaky breath, a gaze fixed on the ground. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to scare him. I didn't think." Her voice cracked, and she looked up at Jacob, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't think it would go this far." The officers exchanged glances, their professional detachment kicking in. "We're going to need you to come with us," the first officer said, stepping closer to Elena. "You have the right to remain silent." Jacob's stomach churned as he watched the scene unfold. Part of him wanted to intervene, to protect her from the consequences of her actions, but another part of him knew this was bigger than them now. Elena's choices had put lives at risk, and there were no easy ways to undo that. Emma watched silently, her heart heavy. She had seen enough of life to know that everyone carried their own burdens, their own pain. But this was different. It wasn't just pain. It was desperation that had spiraled out of control. She glanced at Jacob, who looked utterly lost, and felt a pang of sympathy. He had everything: money, power, status, but right now he looked as broken as any of the people she had met on the streets. As the officers led Elena toward the cruiser, she turned to Jacob one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "I never wanted to lose you." Jacob didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply stood there, drenched and silent, as the woman he had once loved was driven away into the night. Emma shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, she took a small step closer to Jacob. "You'll get through this," she said softly. "It doesn't feel like it now, but you will." Jacob turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emma hesitated and shrugged lightly. "Because someone needed to." The simplicity of her answer hit Jacob harder than anything else that night. He nodded slowly, unsure of what the future held but knowing he owed this girl more than he could ever repay. For now, though, the storm raged on, leaving them both standing on the edge of an uncertain tomorrow. Jacob stood frozen in the rain long after the police cruiser disappeared into the distance. The chill seeped through his soaked suit, but he barely noticed. His mind was a tangled mess of questions, regrets, and confusion. How had his life unraveled so quickly? The woman he had built his world around was gone, taken away in handcuffs. The truth of what she'd done still felt impossible to grasp. And then there was Emma, this stranger who had stepped into his life in the most unexpected way. Emma shifted uncomfortably beside him. She had been silent since Elena left, giving Jacob the space he seemed to need. But now, watching him stand there like a statue, she felt compelled to speak. "You shouldn't stay out here," she said gently. "You're going to get sick." Her words pulled him back to the present. He blinked, as if waking from a dream, and turned to face her. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're right," he said finally. I don't even know where to go from here." Emma hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to help, but her own life was a constant struggle. What could she possibly offer someone like him? And yet, there was something about Jacob's vulnerability that resonated with her. He wasn't just a millionaire in a tailored suit. He was a man whose world had just been shattered. "We all feel lost sometimes," Emma said softly. "But you'll figure it out. You have to." Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. There was something raw and genuine in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "How do you keep going when everything feels hopeless?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his question. She didn't have an easy answer. Her life on the streets had been a constant battle, filled with cold nights, empty stomachs, and the kind of loneliness that gnawed at your soul. But somehow she had survived. I guess I just take it one day at a time, she said finally. When you don't have much, you learn to appreciate the little things. Like being alive. Like tonight. Tonight? Jacob echoed, his brow furrowing. You're alive, Emma said simply. That's something to hold on to, no matter how bad things seem. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, wealth, and status that he had forgotten the value of the basics. Breathing, being, surviving. He nodded slowly, his mind turning over her words. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps pulled their attention. Jacob turned, his body tensing instinctively. A man in a dark hoodie emerged from the shadows, his face partially obscured. His movements were deliberate, his eyes scanning the scene with a calculated intensity that made Jacob's stomach tighten. Something about him felt off, dangerous. Emma stiffened beside him, her instincts flaring. She had encountered enough unsavory characters on the streets to recognize trouble when she saw it. We should go, she whispered, her voice urgent. The man's gaze locked onto them, and he smirked. Going somewhere, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Jacob stepped in front of Emma instinctively, his heart pounding. Can I help you? He asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Actually, yeah, you can. See, I heard about what happened with your wife. Tough break, huh? But I think there's more to the story. I'm very interested in hearing it. Jacob's eyes narrowed. Who are you? Let's just say I have a vested interest in your little predicament. The man replied, his smirk widening. And I think you and I need to have a chat. Alone. Emma grabbed Jacob's arm, her grip tight. Don't, she whispered urgently. We need to get out of here. Jacob hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect himself and the gnawing curiosity about who this man was and what he knew. I'm not going anywhere with you, he said firmly. If you had something to say, you can say it here. The man's expression darkened, his smirk fading. Suit yourself, he said coldly, but you might want to reconsider, because if you don't, things could get messy. Emma's pulse raced as she glanced around, searching for an escape route. The street was eerily quiet, the rain masking the sound of her rapid breathing. We need to go, now, she urged again. Jacob finally nodded, taking a step back. We're done here, he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. But as they turned to leave, the man stepped closer, blocking their path. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he said, his tone laced with menace. You don't know who you're dealing with. Emma's heart pounded as she positioned herself beside Jacob, her mind racing. She had spent years navigating danger, but this felt different. This felt personal. Whatever this man wanted, it wasn't good. The tension hung heavy in the air as the rain continued to fall, the streetlights casting long shadows across the scene. Jacob and Emma exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between them. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. And as the man's smirk returned, a sinister glint in his eye, Jacob knew they were teetering on the edge of something far bigger than either of them could have anticipated. The rain seemed colder now, each drop stinging like a tiny needle against Jacob's skin. He clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. Who was this man? How did he know about Alina? And why was he so invested in their lives? Every instinct told him to run, but the man's ominous demeanor suggested that escape wouldn't be so simple. Emma, standing close beside him, was visibly tense. She had been in countless dangerous situations before, but there was something about this encounter that unsettled her deeply. She could feel the man's eyes on her, cold and calculating, as though he was trying to decide whether she was an obstacle or an asset. Jacob took a step forward, his voice firm despite the growing knot of fear in his chest. If you know about Alina, then you know the police are involved. Whatever you're planning, you're already too late. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the empty street. You think I'm worried about the cops? No, Jacob, this isn't about your wife. It's about you, and what you owe. Jacob frowned, confusion mixing with his unease. What I